All right. Well, Asher, nice to have you on today, and nice to see you again. So, for those who don't know, maybe it would be helpful to start off with a little bit of your background, where you
Sure.
are now, and I guess how you got into this environmental space.
Sure. Yeah. So I am the executive director of a small nonprofit think tank called the Post Carbon Institute. I'm actually based in Corvallis, Oregon, which I know is not too far from your guys' headquarters in Bend. And I got into this work. I got into climate work, although maybe we'll talk later about what Post Carbon Institute does. It's a little broader than climate, but I got actually first involved in climate work back in 2006, right after my first son was born. And I had been running a volunteer program, a leadership program for teens, and I took them to see an inconvenient truth. And I knew about climate. My wife was actually a pretty devout environmentalist herself, and was really working on a lot of like food issues. But that was a big wake up call for me. And I think that those two things coinciding, having a young son and really learning about climate and the severity of it, got me involved in climate work. And initially, I would say the way I just describe it sometimes, I was swimming in the shallow end of the pool in the sense that I was very focused, like a lot of people, I think, at that time, on lifestyle behavior changes that were pretty, in some ways, superficial, changing light bulbs, bringing a canvas bag to the grocery store, all those things, which I think were, important. And, um, but getting involved, being able to study the climate crisis more deeply, thinking more deeply about kind of climate being a symptom of other issues, led me to Post Carbon Institute and doing the work that I do now.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I feel like myself and probably a lot of people listening are hanging out in that shallow end, probably transferring towards the deeper end as they learn more over time. And so I think it's
Yeah.
going to be interesting. And I equally was inspired by I watched a movie that convinced me to stop eating beef
Hmm.
and red meat in that capacity. So the power of media
Absolutely. Yeah.
is out there.
Storytelling is really important,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. Well, maybe talk a little bit about Post Carbon
Sure.
and your initiatives and kind of the ultimate goal of the organization too.
Yeah. So as our name, I think, expresses, we're primarily known for our work looking at energy and the role of energy in society, the transition of our energy system, from one that's largely powered by fossil fuels to one that's powered by renewable energy. And we do see energy as kind of the core driver of society. And it has been actually the driver of all societies. It's the driver of life, right? Without energy, nothing happens. So a lot of our work has been around helping people understand. We all sort of we live. Those of us probably listening to this, and you and I live in a world with a lot of advanced technology and systems that operate really well. So we flick on a light, we go to the gas station, get in our car, we go to the grocery store. Although we're starting to see, I think the veil is being lifted a little bit with COVID and some supply chain issues that we're experiencing right now. But we take this stuff for granted. So part of our work is just to try to help people understand why our world functions the way it does, how we got here, the role that energy has played in that, but more deeply, and this is where our name probably doesn't express what we do sufficiently. It's really looking at the larger system dynamics. So we look at the intersection of energy and the economy, the connections between those two things, and environmental issues, not just climate, but other environmental issues, and then issues around social equity as well. So we call them the 4E sometimes, and we don't think of them necessarily as like E plus E plus E plus E, but more a dynamic of multiplying. They're multiplying and interacting with one another. So a lot of our work as a think tank is to help educate people, help communicate not only that big narrative, why we are where we are right now and where we need to go, but trying to make sense of things as they're unfolding. And I would say we're in a different place right now. You talked about maybe a lot of people still being in the shallow end of the pool. I think collectively we're actually getting into deeper and deeper waters, because I think the reality has become more and more evident to us. Climate in 2006, I think for a lot of people was still something we thought about for our kids or grandkids. Now we think about it for ourselves, and we're starting to realize issues of like, the flow of energy in an economy and globalized supply chains, and what happens if you have a a breakdown in one area, maybe because of a pandemic or something else, and the kind of the
Yeah.
knock-on effects of that. So we try to also help people sort of make sense of what's happening right now because it's so dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. It is so dynamic. And I guess the interconnect and the four E's multiplying
Yeah.
instead of being unique, I guess that's what we're starting to see is the interconnected nature. But I also think that's a good representation of how hard it is to shift away from the
Absolutely.
current world, because
Yeah.
you can't just shift the energy source. You also have to shift the economy
Yeah.
and the implications.
And one of the challenges I would just say briefly on this is that we've done a great job of specializing. Our educational system is built around that. We've got companies that you know they have their niche, you know, in the market. We reward people for specializing in things. We've benefited from people specializing. Look at what's happened with vaccine rollout, for example. I mean, we have we've benefited so much from deep expertise in certain areas, but because we don't necessarily think systemically and holistically, and we don't teach people that way, we sometimes will try to create a solution of a problem over here without realizing that it's actually exacerbating things over there, you know?
Yeah.
And that's, again, part of our job is hopefully to move people a little bit to think more systemically about these challenges.
Yeah, the solution is often completely separate from the problem, I've found, in most things in life. So makes sense. You know, as you look at everything that's happening with those four E's,
Mm-hmm.
and as it relates to companies, those are largely the people listening to this.
Yeah.
You know, where do you see some really bright spots, and where do you see some industries or companies doing great things? And I guess where do you see as
Yeah.
the areas that keep you up at night because they're not changing and not improving?
I mean, that's a great question and a tough question. I I'm I'm really pleased to see, you know, a shift that I think we see happening where corporations, businesses are shifting a little bit about their own goals and expectations for themselves. I mean, the B Corp movement is a good example of that. Um, the effort for a lot of businesses to think about, you know, the triple bottom line, or you can come up with different, you know, ways of categorizing or framing it, but thinking more than just near-term profits. Even though obviously that's a key driver, it remains a key driver in a major pressure point. I think that companies are seeing that their employees are demanding that and are motivated by more than just that simple bottom line. And so as a whole, I see that as a, a bright spot. I think that there are companies, and again, I don't spend my time in the world of business so much, but there are companies that I look at that I think help push. So a company like Patagonia, which I think a lot of people do talk about as a model, the fact that they are thinking about their supply chain a lot, and the fact that they've gone even further to think about, like, buy less of our stuff, you know what I mean? Trying to actually think about, you know, shifting what the business model is a little bit, you know, is a great sign. And then thinking about companies like, and again, I don't know how viable they are, but looking at a company like Fairphone, you know, which is trying to break down a little bit and thinking about their product within a larger system. Where, you know, how are we sourcing all the materials? How are we building this in a way that it could be, you know, it's not a planned obsolescence thing. It's not a situation where, you know, one little part breaks down in this incredibly complex product and the whole thing has to be thrown away. Those things to me are great. I think indicators, beacons, maybe for where corporations can go. The things that keep me up are a lot. I think it comes back to the system, right? What are the systemic pressures on companies? And I think the primary one, and it's not just for companies, but it's for the economy as a whole, is this requirement to grow. And when we have a consumer-based economy, which we do, and we have an economy that has not shown yet, and I have a lot of skepticism about its ability to do this in a deep way, an ability to decouple energy consumption and material consumption from, you know, this output and from profit. If that's limited, right, and companies are required to grow shareholder expectations, thinking about quarterly returns. So it's like the short term focus, the demand for growth, and I would say the expectation that that CEOs and executives and directors feel to meet those expectations is the primary, that's their fiduciary, that's their responsibility, I think sets us in a direction where if we compromise anything, it's always compromising the other stuff. You know what I mean? Because we have to prioritize this. And until we fix that problem, and not just with companies, but with the economy as a whole, which again needs to grow, right now, structurally in order to function, it's the reason why we're facing the climate crisis and these other issues that we're facing.
Yeah, it's interesting because the first, the Patagonia example, stop buying our stuff, is such a unique one, and I think we see this with companies, like their employees are asking for this to happen at companies, but I wouldn't say the leaders they're still in the older generation, if you will, and so it'll be really interesting to see once these, more sustainability and demanding folks become leaders at these companies, do they actually put any of this into action? And I think that's hopefully they do, but ultimately you need to stop the IV drip of it.
Well, and it comes from the bottom and the top. I mean, if there's demand on the part of customers, then there's demand on the part of a workforce, but there's also the right kinds of policies and conditions set, to make a playing field a certain way. This is why I think a lot of companies are supportive of putting a price on carbon. Do you know what I mean? Because they need it to be somehow an even playing field, right? And of course, there are ones who see themselves as pioneering and they're trying to get into a space early, and there's benefits of doing that. But to move collectively, I think that we need those things to come from both directions. The question is, can we do that fast enough? Really?
Yeah, it's quantifying the cost, and so then once you quantify that, they can model it in. And
right, we've externalized the cost. Frankly, let's be honest. I mean, they're not part of the cost of doing business, and they need to be on some level.
Yeah, it is still hard though, because the main challenge you're identifying is the consumer demand has shifted, largely for premier price things to a more environmental option in general. But the main issue is there's still the demand there. And so it's a challenging area. And
it is.
Well, as someone who has been trying to become a B Corp for the last 18 months, I know they have an incredible amount of demand. And so it's great to see that going. And we've been fully approved, waiting for the final approval, I think, for the last 6 months, just because they're so short-staffed.
Interesting. So I guess not a good problem for you, but a good problem as a whole, probably.
Yeah, no, great problem. And happy to wait. I guess, knowing your role and to educate people and really convince them of the importance of this, I often come across people who I don't want to say are not believers, but don't fully understand this. How would you think about, over a lunch conversation, educating them and, trying to change them even in a small way to make lifestyle changes, or to understand the issue and what they can do about it on a larger scale?
Yeah, it's such a tough one, because I don't know that there's like a single simple sort of way of doing it, because I think people's priorities and their worldviews are so different. I think what is common is finding the things that people care about and taking the time to actually listen. So and I'm guilty of this. I think a lot of my peers and colleagues in the environmental sustainability space, we sometimes fall into this trap of thinking, well, we have this information that everybody needs to have, and we're right about it, and people need to feel as urgently about it as we do, and we don't take the time to put that into context that is relevant for those people. And I'll just share a little story that's not my story, but I think is indicative of this, and that is, there's a story that I heard of one of the organizers of Love Canal, which is, people can look it up. It was one of the first sort of really grassroots environmental efforts organized by moms who are concerned about what they're seeing in terms of the impacts of pollution on their families, on their kids. And she was invited to come talk at an event that this group had been organizing, I think in a borough in New York, who were opposed to some new plant coming in, and they were worried about the toxics and the localized pollution of that. And nobody showed up to this event. And they were embarrassed, and she asked them, they were at a bar, and she asked them, well, what did you do to get the word out? And they kind of explained all the things. And she's like, you didn't figure out what actually matters to people in this neighborhood. And she went up to this guy at the bar who was watching a football game, and she sort of was like asking if he knew about it. And he's like, I don't care about that stuff. And she's like, what do you care about? And he's like, I care about traffic. I'm a truck driver, and on this road, there's like a left turn light, and there's a left turn and there's no light there, and the cars are backed up, and I'm stuck. And she's like, well, what do you think that traffic is going to be like once this plane goes in? And just that question completely, tipped him. He's like, oh, this impacts me. So it's really about finding the things that people care about, the things that are important to them, and making that connection, and sometimes that's place. Have you seen the climate changes in your own community? What are you observing? Because people are observant if they stop and think about it. So that would probably be my sort of main recommendation.
Yeah, relate it to them. I mean,
Yeah.
we live in a huge world, and what we're facing in Oregon is very different than what people are facing in Florida, and understanding,
And back to the systems thing, it's when you start looking at the connections, it is not hard to make a connection to the thing that you care about with the thing that they care about, because they're all connected.
Yeah, very connected. Are there any, when you were saying that, made me think, I mean, we're talking a lot US focused.
Yeah.
Obviously, some countries are far more advanced in their pricing of carbon. When you think about Europe,
yeah.
How far ahead are those countries? And are you starting to see the changes in those countries that we hope to see, in our own country?
It's funny because I would say they're ahead, but they're ahead in a particular direction, and there's another direction that other countries are much further ahead on. Okay, so yes, they're ahead. I would say when you think about, like, I remember, I was born in the Netherlands and spent a lot of time there and lived there for a little while after college, and they were, you get taxed based on the sort of the weight of your car. Like that's heretical here in the United States. Can you imagine, trying to do something like that? And that was even sort of like pre-climate. It was just for them. It's like you're doing more wear and tear on the roads, and this is something that we collectively, own and need to care for. So pay your fair share. I would say they're in Europe, Western Europe. They're definitely ahead on those kinds of things. They're certainly ahead on infrastructure. A lot of that is, frankly, their communities were built before fossil fuels. It's a lot easier to do that. Do you know what I mean? Than it is to try to do that in like the western part of the United States, or the Midwest. So it kind of makes sense on some level. We also have a very individualistic society in the U.S. And so just culturally, there's some differences. How do you bring those things over? I think it's partly the more and more evident it is that things have to change, and the more and more viable alternatives are. I think that sort of combination will lead to some of those changes. It's tough because when you say, hey, let's do what the French do, people don't necessarily want to hear that. Maybe they'll hear, hey, let's do what the Californians do, because California has been great about a lot of things, not all things. But the more and more models we have, and we actually have models from, the heartland of the United States and other communities that have done some really interesting things, to pointing to those. What I was saying about other countries doing things that are in a different direction, there are communities that are much more connected and recognize the value of ecosystems and nature. And I think that's a big shift that we actually need to make, which is, we still, and this is even true in the climate conversation, see ourselves as trying to control nature. We're even having a conversation about how to put a price on nature, the ecosystem services that nature provides, and all this stuff. And it's like all about sort of like, how do we control it, and indigenous, communities for thousands and thousands of years have controlled nature on some level, but they also saw themselves as part of an ecosystem, a mutually dependent ecosystem. And I think if we see that, and we recognize that more, so learning from, communities in Africa and South America, the global South, primarily, but even, some indigenous, communities here in the United States or North America, just that different relationship to nature, I think, is an important thing for us to try to internalize. It's hard when you live in an urban environment, and not there are a lot of kids who grow up never looking at the stars,
Yeah.
so we have to figure that out, but I think that's an important piece that we can't forget in this.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up because something I always think is we just need to keep going back to what used to be done in a lot of ways. The
Yeah.
Europe example of how they structured cities, and then you go even further back to the traditional life. If you think about in the global South, they didn't have any other options. They had to live in a sustainable way with nature.
Yeah. Well, for 99% of our history as a species,
Yeah.
that's what we did. We actually lived on a solar income. We lived on
Huh.
renewable energy,
Yeah.
and we had to live with those flows.
Yeah. It's I had never thought about going that direction because you always think, oh, let's model ourselves after countries that may be 10 years ahead of us in this path, but is that the right path to go down?
Yeah, I mean, God, that's a whole area for debate. I don't think people want to go back to, this idea of a hard scrabble life, living on the frontier or something. Um, uh, it would be nice if there was a balance of being able to take advantage of modern comforts and technologies,
Yeah.
but also living much more within the means of what nature provides us on a kind of an
Yeah.
annual basis or seasonal basis.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if you were to give advice to individuals who are listening
Yeah.
to this and want to make changes in their own life to help further kind of all the work that you're doing and getting us closer to, this more interconnected in a positive way world,
Yeah.
apart from, it sounds like the first piece of advice would be stop buying stuff. What else
Yeah.
would you be kind of the tidbits to take away if they want to continue to make lifestyle changes?
I would say, two broad buckets here. Putting aside, call it conscious consumerism, being thoughtful about what you're consuming. The first is actually dig into this. Try to, and obviously this is my bias because it's part of what we do, right? Is to try to help people think more deeply about stuff. But there's something really important that comes from a mind shift change, and I think we are so, especially in this culture now, we're so living in the moment, almost nanosecond to nanosecond, but stepping back and thinking from a much bigger picture about what society is, what community is, what our role is as people in the world. What do we want? How do we want to contribute? How do we fit into that? And stepping back and trying to see that big picture and understand the big picture, I think is a really important first step, because then it helps you understand sort of where, if the whole system in a sense has to change, which in my view it does, we can't all do that. We can't all make those changes, completely change our lives 100%. And even if we did do that, the rest of the world is not following, right? Mm-hmm. So it's looking at that and saying collectively we need to go on this course. Where do I move myself? And that's about looking at, so for example, food. I think a lot of people are motivated by thinking differently about their relationship with food. And that's a great place to go. There could be other things. But having that context and then finding out the thing that feels most doable for you in your circumstances or that you're most passionate about is really important. And the other piece is what you actually touched on a little bit, and that was going back a little bit to maybe it's not the way that we used to live, but how we used to relate, right? And we've created an economy that is so transactional, and I actually think that we're, like it or not, we are going to be faced with increasing challenges. And we talked about the 4 E's, and there are challenges in all of those 4 E's. I know nobody wants to hear this because we've been going through this slog through this pandemic that feels endless, and everyone just wants to get back to sort of normal with that. But when you look at what's actually happening in all of these systems, there is no going back to normal per se, and I think we need to internalize that and reckon with that, and we also need to learn how to work together with people to problem solve those things. Sometimes we talk about it as coming up with responses to a predicament versus coming up with solutions to a problem. A problem is something finite and definite, and you can solve it and then go back. predicament is something you're going to have to reckon with, right?
Yeah.
And that is going to have to be done collectively. So getting into relationship is really key. And I would say start with your community. Now, not everyone is in a situation where they're really grounded in community, but find community, I think, is really important. And I think that's going to be very, very important in how we get through kinds of the challenges that we face in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it seems like largely educate yourself and understand what, once you know the entire picture, you can understand what's most relevant to you, and then embedding yourself in a community and
Yeah.
investing
And that could be
in that.
volunteering in something that's unrelated to climate, but it's creating those connections, in that feeling of mutual aid and reciprocity and all that. I think is really going to be key for us.
Yeah, it creates. What we like to say is we try to create a promoter out of everybody. So if we volunteer with someone, can we create a promoter out of that person so they can go and spread the word?
Yeah.
Because ultimately that's what's going to shift, and these people fighting for change at their own companies as well. So,
yeah.
All right, final question, and this could be the hardest for you.
Yeah.
Excluding the climate space, your favorite nonprofit and why?
Yeah, God, it's hard to come up with just one. Maybe I'll give a very local example. It's my favorite local thing, and it gets to what we were just talking about, which is it's not even a nonprofit necessarily. It's something that's being fiscally sponsored by another nonprofit in my community here. But it was a very grassroots effort called It's On Us Corvallis. I live in a town called Corvallis. And when the pandemic hit initially, and we were most of us in lockdown, except for, essential workers, restaurants in our community were really hard hit. There were also people who, income was not coming in for them, and they were having a hard time trying to figure out how to make ends meet, how to even feed themselves. So this group of people, started this project called It's On Us Corvallis, and they crowdfunded money from the community of people who had the privilege and the ability to give resources. They used that money and they paid restaurants to keep them viable, to make really good quality meals. This is not a food bank thing, and nothing against food banks, but it's not canned corn or something. Really high quality meals for people in the community who couldn't afford to pay. And they would open up, these restaurants. And I remember one day I went downtown, there was a line around the block, and it was just people going in and picking up something, no questions asked at all. And people would go get a meal, and they actually did a survey afterwards to ask people, and remarkably, 60% of the people who contributed money to It's On Us also got a meal. And what is so wonderful to me about that, and also then we had fires, talking about climate, we had fires, and, over the summer, and people that were in the eastern part of the state had to be relocated, and they were at the fairgrounds here in our area, and It's On Us coordinated to get meals to those folks as well. It's this idea of mutual aid, of collectively coming together to try to take care of one another. Again, no questions asked. Yeah. And when we do that, we see that people want to give as much as they take. Sometimes we worry about everyone trying to take advantage or whatever. I don't think that that's true when we're in a relationship with one another. So it was very inspirational to me. And there's lots of examples like that in lots of communities, but that's my local one.
I love that, because you're so invested in your own community. From what I know about Corvallis, it's a very tight-knit community, and you're so invested. You're willing to invest in it as well as take. What is a fair share, and just support the livelihood of everyone there, the owners, the employees, and the people that live there.
Yep.
We need more of that community, is what I think you're describing.
I think we're gonna need it, and we're gonna get it.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate all the time. Where can people find you? We'll link everything in the description, but is there anywhere you want to lead them to?
Yeah, our organizational website is postcarbon.org, but our flagship website is actually called resilience.org. And there we publish, articles sort of looking at these 4E issues. If anyone wants to sort of get that deep dive education, we actually created a course, an online course. It's about 4 hours of videos broken up into 22 chapters, and that's called Think Resilience. And you can find that at resilience.org, or you can just Google, Think Resilience, and you'll find it. And we are making it free, that course, for anybody who wants to take it. It's our best way of trying to distill as much of these issues as possible down into not a soundbite, but into a condensed form. So.
Yeah, well, it's awesome. Appreciate the time, and
Yeah, no
thank
problem.
you again.
Yeah, thanks for your work. Take care.